that I feel like we have this regulatory moat around it. So definitely in 2013, I was like, what the hell is this thing? I don't really get it. It just sounds dumb. 2017, I was definitely concerned. I was like, they could ban this. China banned it. I know it's banned in Bolivia. I think it's banned in Pakistan. I was like, they can ban this. They certainly could. I mean, it would be difficult. It could still exist being banned. But, if it was illegal in Europe and the US to use Bitcoin, yes, it could be this kind of, underground cypherpunk tool, but it wouldn't be what it is now, right? It would have difficulties. I feel like it's got this regulatory moat around it now. I think so many companies are invested. So much of the infrastructure, especially in the US, exists. Actually, so much of the wealth exists in US hands. I certainly don't feel like the US is going to ban it. And if the US isn't going to ban it, I feel like a lot of other Western nations aren't going to ban it. I also think they'll face a massive regulatory challenge. I think there'll be a massive fight back against it. And I think on the regulatory side, whilst we might have prying eyes who want to know more about what we're doing, who it is holding the Bitcoin, I do still feel like we have this regulatory moat now, and I just don't see it getting banned. I don't see that as a narrative. I thought that was a viable argument in 2017 that you had to defend because it was a possibility. I don't see that anymore.
Yeah, I agree with Peter here. I think that it would be virtually impossible to legislate Bitcoin into zero. I mean, you could pass legislation that makes it difficult to transact, difficult to buy on exchanges, and just really annoying. And that will slow the adoption. That will hurt the price measured in dollars. But it actually increases the value proposition of Bitcoin in the long term. And there's going to be people who use it regardless of whether or not it's illegal. Because there's a lot of people who think, okay, I'm not actually hurting anybody. This is a victimless crime. It's just it's a crime in letter only. It's not a crime in spirit. And there's a lot of people in the world who would rather use it and be a quote unquote criminal than to give it up and be a goody two shoes, if you will.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question around, will governments ban Bitcoin? And I actually wrote an article about this in my newsletter where I explored, how would a government go about banning Bitcoin? If Bitcoin's market penetration in terms of how many people in a population own Bitcoin, if that percentage goes above a certain level, Bitcoin becomes very hard to ban, as the politicians, the businesses, the hedge funds, the wealthy, the poor all own it. It makes it very hard to ban it or penalize it, because if you were a politician who voted for that, you would then be immediately voted out of office because people would be pissed because you just made them lose a bunch of money. And also these politicians will likely own it, which makes them, politicians are typically very, they're not exactly what they would call public servants. Most politicians just look for their own self-interest. They look out for their own self-interest. And so if they own Bitcoin, that's a good thing because then they won't attack it. Mm-hmm. So Bitcoin is protected by adoption. It's based on how many people own it. And you mentioned, we mentioned that PayPal, Robinhood, Cash App have it. I mean, these are big companies and more of these will come in. That makes it very hard to ban it. And also you'd have to ban it in every country in the world, which that has never worked for drug enforcement, nor has it worked for climate change. Governments across the world haven't come together to ban something or rally behind something because governments are inherently against each other on a variety of other issues.
Yeah, this is a great point that Dan is making. Basically that governments around the world haven't come together to agree on a single issue, maybe ever. I don't know. Certainly you can get a handful of governments to agree, but all of them, I don't think it's happened before. So I could imagine a scenario. I should phrase it like this. Not only could I imagine it, but I think the most likely scenario is a movement towards global governance. I think that the powerful governments of the world are trying to get more powerful, which is nothing new. That's always what happens with powerful governments. I think we're seeing more international, global organizations that want to control more things. The economy, health, the weather, probably education, medicine, and so forth. I think there'll be more and more of those organizations, and obviously law. So I think a lot of countries will join different international groups, and I think there will be an attempt. There will be an attempt, an ongoing fight from global governments, IMF, World Bank, and so forth, World Economic Forum. There will be an attempt to suppress Bitcoin. I don't know the specifics of what they'll do. I mean, obviously, I don't know. But I think they may try to ban Bitcoin in their member countries, right? Whatever that organization is. Like, our member countries are not going to use Bitcoin. Our member countries are not going to mine Bitcoin, blah, blah, blah. I think there will be an attempt. I don't think it'll be successful, but it could lead to, one of the pullbacks, one of the bear markets, if you will. Call it 7 or 8 years from now. Let's call it 2029-ish, something like that.
Well, there is the other point, Dan, is that, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm not sure if you listened to Nick Carter's discussion on Grant Williams' podcast with Mike Green yet. Very interesting discussion, but when Mike mentioned about the US government banning it, when Nick Carter said, well, I've become a dissident. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, look, if the UK banned it, it would almost certainly now make me reconsider my residential status in the UK if they went to ban it. I was like, well, this is my life. This is what I do. I'm off, and I will go to one of the environments which supports it, someone like Malta or, I don't know, but I would go somewhere else.
Yeah, we become citizens of Bitcoin in a way. Bitcoin supersedes national boundaries, and by storing value in Bitcoin, now we're all incentivized to keep it alive and to protect it. And also, we start to, when you believe in Bitcoin, you start to question the nature of your reality. You start to look around and you're like, wait, why do these laws exist? Why am I having to provide an ID at the bank to withdraw my own cash? And you start to go down this rabbit hole of questioning everything. And once you start doing that, there's no way to go back. You've seen the world for what it is. You've woken up to the matrix. You've woken up to the world being, these governments being largely ineffective.
Yeah, Dan makes a good point here. Like, once you start understanding what Bitcoin is and how it works and why it was created and the effect it has on people and the effect it has on you personally and how you view spending, how you view the world, how you view laws, I mean, your perception will be forever changed. And I don't just mean like all of a sudden you'll love Bitcoin and never change your mind. I don't mean that. I mean like the way you view the world, the way you view your own time, your own energy, your own money, the way you view work, relationships, time itself. I mean, it's incredible. It's awesome, right? I encourage everyone to like really dive in, And if you have like questions or doubts, I mean, speak up, ask somebody, like ask me in the comment section, or ask your friends, whatever. It's really incredible. But when you see how governments react to it and how largely ineffective they are, to be honest, right, at pretty much anything they try to accomplish. And I don't just mean like in the last year or so. I mean, pretty much any government around the world throughout history, they tend to be really bad. They tend to be really ineffective at accomplishing their goals. But they don't admit it, obviously. So anyways, you just see the world in a different way. And in regards to the comment about becoming a dissident and, reconsidering citizenship, this is something I've been thinking about for years. Right, the fact that I'm an American was just an accident of birth. Right, I didn't choose to be American, and I love American ideals, and I think they're actually encapsulated very nicely in Bitcoin, believe it or not. And when I look around at America today, it doesn't look like it reflects American ideals, and that hasn't sat well with me for years, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't know if it makes more sense to fight for change, or if it makes sense to just go where I can find American ideals. I believe in the ideals. Maybe not necessarily this particular patch of geography. I don't know. I'm not really decided, but it is something I'm thinking about, and I think about more and more, and Bitcoin encourages me to think that way. So anyways, I think you've got to. I think to not think that way is closed-minded, quite frankly, and being closed-minded, I think, is to do yourself a disservice.
Listen, I'm going to pull you up on one thing then. So, you said earlier you think this cycle is going to be like no other previous. It might not have the same bear market play out. So if it does play out like other cycles, I think I'm even getting this from one of your tweets. You think it'll be about 250 days from now will be the peak. Now, if it plays like other cycles, we'll hit whatever price. Let's say for the sake of making this argument easy, it hits 100K. Could be 2, could be 3, could be a million, whatever. But let's say 100K. Then perhaps we will see a 70 to 80% drawdown, which means we could drop down to 20, 30K. That's a potential. Do you see that possibly not happening in this cycle then? Do you see something different happening?
Yeah, you're talking from peak to trough. So that wouldn't happen instantly. That would happen from the top of the bull all the way to the bottom of the bear. I don't think so. And the reason why is that this time people understand it much better. So when I talked about those cycles before where you had people come for the speculation and stay for the sound money, well, more people now understand why it's sound money. Because of COVID, they better understand why Bitcoin is valuable. And they're not just in it for the quick, flip of a 1x, 2x return. They're in it because they need to flee policies with their local governments, where their local governments are printing tons of money and devaluing their currency. So when that happens, I don't think we see a bear, because the bear before was just all the speculators leaving. But now these speculators are largely people fleeing for good reasons. So I see the bear market being much more mild this time around, as people woke up to Bitcoin's value and they come in and they store value in there permanently. And so I just don't think we're going to see that previous cycle from both a bear perspective. So how much drawdown will we have from the peak, and also the bull? A lot of people reference the 2017 cycle because that drew in the most folks before this cycle. And they reference that as their anchor point for how a bull run looks. Well, in 2013, we actually had 2 bull runs. It went from $10 to $260 down to $100 in March 2013. And then later that year, from like October through December, it went from $100 to $1,200. So we could see something like that, and I would consider that to be a super cycle.
Okay, that description right there of what Dan considers a super cycle, I actually think is very reasonable. That's something I recently discovered when I was revisiting the patterns in Bitcoin's cycle. And I realized that as a sort of a double pump in the current bull run makes a lot of sense. So I don't know about the order of magnitude. I don't know. But I don't think a single pump is actually most likely. I think a double pump is more likely. I don't think it will be on the order of magnitude of the 2013 bull run that he just described, which went from 10 ultimately up to 1,200 after the double pump. So it was 120x. I don't think we're going to do that. But we could actually, now that I think about it. What was the low most recently? Something like 3,000 in the current bear market, because we were at like 19,000, almost 20,000 at the end of 2017. I think we dropped to about 3,000 and change at some point in 2019. Yeah, so from 3,000, if we did 120x, that's 360,000. So maybe that's actually not that crazy. It's weird when you actually do those numbers. So what was it? I'm thinking he went from 10 to 260 is 26x, something like 75,000 would be 75,000, maybe 80,000 in the current bull run. And then it dropped down to 100, from 260 to 100. So call that it went down to 40% of where it was. So that would be like going up to 75, down to 30,000, and then up to 360,000. Maybe. I mean, 360 seems like the highest I could possibly imagine Bitcoin going in its current, bull run or double bull run or super cycle. So let's see where Dan comes up with $1 million.
Let me tell you about another mindset shift I've had with this one as well. So previously, where I've calculated my Bitcoin wealth in pounds and dollars, I've looked at it and I've always thought, what could this next cycle do? And I often refer to my personal trainer. John, I should get him on one day, let people talk about it, because this guy's just like a guy bought Bitcoin. He doesn't understand XPubs or any stuff like that. But he was saying to me when we were training last time, he was like, what's your number? What's your target number? And when do you think you'll sell some? Because just tell me and I'll sell at the same time. And, I talked about different numbers with him, but the last conversation I had with him is like, do you know what? I don't think I've got a target number to sell, and I'll tell you why. Say it's 100K, and what am I going to do? Sell 25% of my Bitcoin, 50% of my Bitcoin? What am I going to do? And then what? Put those pounds in the bank? What if it then overshoots that by even like 50%? I've suddenly lost out on all of that. Okay, so what if I said my target was 150 and it overshoots that? Or say it hits 150 and then suddenly drops down to 80. I'm like, oh shit, 150 at the top. I better sell some because it might go low and then it goes up again. It's like I'm back to trying to pick the tops and bottoms of markets, which I just can't predict. So I'm not going to sell my Bitcoin. And the reason being is I talk to people now about, you need to work out your Bitcoin score. You work out the percentage of the 21 million you've got, and that's your score. And I think I want to keep that as high as possible. So my future use case of Bitcoin is to use it. We both get challenged this, but we both agree with the idea of using our Bitcoin to loan to make interest. I also would happily take a loan out against my Bitcoin and let my Bitcoin work for me. But the reality is, why sell any of it? What's the point? You could play those tops and bottoms wrong, and you can end up with a lower stack of Bitcoin and then a pile of dollars or pounds, which we already know are fucking useless. So I've had a mind shift change now that I just have this goal down. Every month I want more Bitcoin than the previous month, and I accept at some point it's going to shoot up, and then some point it's going to shoot down. But this is like my vault, which is setting me up for life and setting my family up for life. I've just got no need to sell it unless I need to sell it.
With this cycle, I think it's going to be funny because you're going to see a lot of these older Bitcoiners who might want to, cash out. And look, if you want to buy a house, if you've got a partner who goes, look, if we don't buy this house, I'm going to leave you. You got to do what you got to do.
Yep, I can relate to that. Yep, I think that's definitely going to happen with me. So, my plan is to sell my Bitcoin only if I have high conviction that we're really at a market top. If I don't have conviction, if I don't have really high conviction when it happens, I'll just hold. And the only reason I would sell, it's not really for the dollars. It's so that I could temporarily hold dollars in the really short term, and then when the price of Bitcoin drops relative to dollars, I can buy more Bitcoins, at the bottom of the market. So the only reason I would sell my Bitcoin is if I thought I could buy more of them later. I don't claim to be good at picking market tops and bottoms. Definitely, I'm not going to make that claim. So again, if I don't have strong conviction, okay, this is a market top, then I'm just not going to sell. The exception being if it's to buy a house.
Now, there's a couple different really cool ways to minimize your, especially the worry that when you sell, you'll sell and Bitcoin keeps going higher. And also the idea that you have less of a Bitcoin stack. There's three ways that I think are really cool. You and I both covered earning yield on your Bitcoin. That comes with risk. People pay you lend your Bitcoin out to folks. They use it for different trading activities, and you earn a yield on it. So you can earn sort of like an income stream from your coins. This comes with risk. That's why you're earning the yield. It is not risk-free. The two other ways: borrowing against your Bitcoin. Borrow dollars against your Bitcoin. If the value of your Bitcoin drops and it gets close to the loan value, you could be margin called, which means you either have to post more collateral or pay back the loan. So going on margin or borrowing dollars against your Bitcoin is not a risk-free operation either. It can be extremely stressful, especially with Bitcoin's volatility. So that's one way to minimize your any sort of loss aversion when it comes to selling your Bitcoin. And then the third would be a covered call strategy. You can earn a yield by selling your upside on your Bitcoin past a certain price. So for example, if you sell the upside on your Bitcoin past $100,000 at the end of March, other traders will compensate you for that opportunity or that optionality. It comes at a huge risk. If you don't structure it properly, you've now sold your upside past a certain price on your coins to where you earn all of the upside from here to 100,000, but you've foregone all upside past 100,000.
Okay, guys, the one thing I'll say here is if you don't know what margin is, and if you don't know what a covered call is, and all these fairly exotic schemes that Dan is talking about, if you don't know what they are, be careful. Just be careful about jumping into them because once you hear about them, you're like, oh, I could 10x my money on top of this other thing and 11% in this. It's really easy to get greedy, but it's even easier to lose everything. So, yeah, by all means, go ahead and learn about stuff, but do your own research and start small. Start small.
It's interesting out those things because I thought of borrowing against my Bitcoin and then to buy more Bitcoin, but that made me nervous. I essentially, my approach was to borrow against. I was essentially borrowing against my business, right? I knew I had the cash flow to support it. I mean, $800 a month payments, nothing compared to the business cash flow. So I knew I could easily support that, and I didn't have to risk my Bitcoin, but acquired more Bitcoin through it. And it was a bit of an experiment. I actually kind of wish I'd borrowed a lot more, but by the by, it is what it is. But I mean, the point being is like, I think when we're talking about this idea of a super cycle, it just adds into the mature narrative. We've got professional institutional grade custody. We've got great onboarding products. We've got Bitcoin in nearly every market in the world. We've now got the financialization through companies like Unchained and BlockFi. We've got the regulatory moat. We have COVID. We have governments printing money at ridiculous rates. Like you say, everything's feeding into this cycle, the super cycle. I think we've got one thing working against us, just one thing, and I think it's unit price. I think it's the only thing that works against us.
Let me touch on one more point around borrowing and margin, and then we'll go to unit, like denomination. So Pierre Rochard and others have described this as a speculative attack. With the Fed and other central banks holding interest rates so low, it's really cheap to borrow fiat. Well, if you can borrow fiat and at a super low rate, like 2% a year, 3% a year, Bitcoin becomes an incredibly interesting opportunity. So there's a speculative attack where folks start to borrow as many dollars or euros or yen as they can to buy Bitcoin. And Bitcoin just gets pushed up with that sort of incentive, with that sort of momentum, which is sort of like, I think what we'll see in this cycle is like people look at really cheap dollars to borrow and go, well, Bitcoin's return is phenomenal, and I can borrow dollars for 2%. So I think that's a really interesting speculative attack that Pierre hypothesized back in the day, and I think we're going to see in this cycle where all this debt will be generated just to buy Bitcoin.
Yes, for sure. I agree with Dan here. It's already happening. It's going to continue to happen. Some people will make a lot of money, so to speak, off of that trade, and others who don't know what they're doing will lose a lot of money. So again, be careful.
So let me ask you, Dan, through this cycle, what are you looking at? What makes this a super cycle? Like, have you got certain metrics? You're like, okay, is it like the length of the bull market? Is it whether we have a drawdown? Is it how high it goes? I mean, like I said, I've seen these range of predictions. Plan B's got the famous 288 one. I think I've seen Woody Woo put it at something at 400. I think Dan at Pantera's got a more conservative, like 126. Raoul Powell did one that could have got up to 1.2 million. Like, there's a range, big range out there. Like, is it the price that makes it a super cycle? What makes this a super cycle?
That's a great question. I think the price is price is the cleanest distillation of all of the narratives. So I think price is what we look at to define a super cycle. Yes, sure, there's a lot of on-chain metrics and volume and everything else, but the price is the cleanest distillation, or as product folks might call it, the KPI. I think, we look at, there's a whole bunch of ways to look at this, right? If we look at what a traditional cycle would look like, people are looking at anywhere between 100,000 and 250,000. That's using like historical price action. That's looking at like a decaying rate of return with the cycles. There's a million ways to slice this, right? So I think between 100 and 400K would be, between 100 and 300K would be defined as a classic cycle. A super cycle would maybe take that a little bit higher to like plus 800,000, right? So that's where maybe a super cycle, I would maybe use that as the definition of one, is like going past like 800,000 or closer to 1 million. I think that would be like by the way, a super cycle is more of a fun idea to throw around and think through. And the reason why I like it too is that almost every single time I've looked at Bitcoin over the last 8 years, in every single market, the status quo is typically wrong. Like, whatever everyone's predicting, it's probably not going to do that. And no one's predicting a super cycle. No one's really thinking about like, oh, wait, this time is very different. People are like, oh, let's look at the last two bull runs. I'm like, yeah, but the last two bull runs didn't have COVID or anything. And so I think that, like I would say like close to 1 million is what the KPI would be for a super cycle. And why I like it is no one's talking about it. No one even thinks that's possible. And everyone just thinks it's going to do what it did before. And it's a very different environment.
Let me.
Well, it's certainly fun to think about. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that this time is different. Obviously, there are differences, right? COVID and everything else. But there's always going to be differences. That doesn't mean that the pattern somehow breaks. So I don't know. I'm not prepared to agree with Dan on 800,000 or 1 million. I'm just not prepared to agree. I'm not going to disagree. I just don't necessarily connect the dots between all of the factors that I do agree with and the conclusion that those factors somehow imply a super cycle or a very high price. I just don't see the connection there. So it's possible. I think it's unlikely. My personal price prediction is actually the very wide range that he gave between 100,000 and 300,000. And then I would expect a drawdown of at least 50% from whatever it goes to. So if it peaks at 200,000, I would expect it to drop below 100,000 and then form a new bull cycle from there. So I mean, obviously, time will tell.
Carter and Mike Green's conversation. Mike Green focused on that Bitcoin's a potential national security threat. I disagree with him, but he's saying essentially, because countries like Iran and Russia have access to, if the state wants to mine Bitcoin like they have in Venezuela, they essentially have free power. They can print free money in some ways. I mean, obviously there is a certain amount of cost, but I think it'll be negligible in terms of like impact upon inflation. But they can essentially print free money. And he talks about them printing free dollars. I actually think they're talking about printing free Bitcoin. It actually proves the strength of Bitcoin. But by the by, if other countries start to see this and start saying, hold on, we have access, and any country which has a struggling economy. I mean, Argentina. Why isn't the government in Argentina, printing, mining Bitcoin? I mean, they all own the power grids within their country, but also could even the USG look at this? And I mean, I don't know if this is thinking too far. I would say, well, hold on, we should be mining if everyone else is. That is the real scenario where we start to see Bitcoin being a race amongst states to accumulate.
Totally. And this is one of the final stages of Bitcoin's success, is when central banks start to buy Bitcoin, is when sovereign wealth funds buy Bitcoin, and when governments start to enter mining. This would be considered like a very late stage of Bitcoin being successful. And we're starting...
Well, they've entered mining. Venezuela's mining, Iran is mining, Russia's mining.
We're starting to see glimmers of this. And what's really wild, though, is like when you look at governments, they have control over their population. They also typically have control over energy, which means that they could probably want to harness that and utilize that to print more coins. What's interesting is governments in the future could create bonds based on this as well, where they like buy a bunch of miners and create like a government bond where you can buy into like this mining operation on like a huge, $100 billion operation or something, something really massive. But yeah, in the future, it'll be a combination of both companies and governments that mine. Or some sort of quasi, maybe in between. If it's a more free market society, it'll be mainly companies. If it's like kind of a mixture of both, maybe governments contract with companies to go mine for them. But yeah, essentially, you're going to see the Bitcoin harnessing all of the excess electricity in the world, and there's a lot of it. And governments are going to look at Bitcoin's rise in price and go, well, how do we get more of this? And they're likely going to want to tap into this free energy that they have. And so, yeah, Bitcoin increasingly starts to get woven throughout the fabric of both governments, companies, and people.
Yeah, exactly. I totally share Dan's vision of the future in terms of Bitcoin adoption by governments. It's going to appear in sovereign wealth funds and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, we do see glimmers of it now, as he mentioned, and it's only going to accelerate. And a major game theory dynamic at play here is that no government is going to want to be left out of the party, so to speak. So first, there will be, the countries that choose to mine Bitcoin are the ones that have high upside and low downside. For example, Iran. They're already sanctioned by the United States. It's already very hard for them to be a part of the legacy financial system and to engage in international commerce. It's already very hard for them. So they don't have much to lose, right? They just have tremendous upside. So it makes sense. And we're going to start to see more and more countries who do that. And the ones who are latest to the game are the ones who have the most to lose by acknowledging Bitcoin's validity, so to speak, like the United States, unfortunately. If the United States government admits that Bitcoin is somehow valuable and they start mining it, they undermine their own power in the world. So that's an interesting dynamic, the incentives and the adoption curve of countries, and at the same time, the sort of counterforce of legislation, right? As you have more individuals and companies and so forth in a given country who adopt and use Bitcoin, it's harder and harder for the government to ban it and to make rules against it because of popular opinion. So there's sort of these two forces of like grassroots adoption, like bottom-up adoption, and top-down legislation. And I think we're moving in one direction. I think eventually, everyone's going to have to capitulate. All governments and everything, they're going to have to capitulate and acknowledge that, you know what, it's in everyone's best interest, including our own, right? As a government, it's in everyone's best interest to have this global, decentralized money that nobody controls and nobody issues. It's just better for everyone. And I think it's inevitable, and it's very fun to watch it happen.
Is there any part of this super cycle I've not asked you about, or any part of it that I've not covered with you?
I think that's, we didn't spend a ton of time on narrative. I think like we touched on it earlier about Bitcoin being the singular narrative, but I don't think people really understood how confusing 2017 was. Like you had Bitcoin and you had Pyrite, which is Bcash. And that was pretty confusing for folks. So like, what's the real Bitcoin? And there's a lot of muddying of the waters on the Confederates side, which I would consider the Bcashers. They're the Confederates, right? They're the Confederates who ultimately lost this battle. But, there's a lot of confusion there. They tried to muddy the waters. Certain wealthy individuals tried to pay off companies and people. And, that was a huge headwind for Bitcoin, a massive one. That was one of the most stressful moments in Bitcoin for me because you had the community fight itself. It was a civil war. And, we don't...
Well, better it happened then than now.
Totally. And we got that out of the way. And Bitcoin survived that, which was an incredible thing. Like, Ethereum and none of these other coins really have had that moment. Yeah, sure, Ethereum has Ethereum Classic, but no one's on that. Like, no one cares about Ethereum Classic. And so Bitcoin had a huge headwind then, and the ICOs and Ethereum craze. Bitcoin doesn't have any of that. I mean, the institutions are only buying Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's narrative is perfectly highlighted by this macro environment. I think that means that, Bitcoin really accrues a lot of the demand that had previously gone to other alts. And that makes me really, really excited because it is such a nice crystallization, a compression of what I would consider the only meaningful narrative in the space, which is that Bitcoin's a great store of value, and that I think will be huge. So I don't think we can underestimate how beneficial a singular narrative will be for Bitcoin.
Yeah, he makes a great point that there really is a singular narrative here. Like, it's not like Bitcoin and Ethereum, or Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, or Bitcoin and altcoins. It's just Bitcoin. It's just Bitcoin. That's the predominant narrative right now. And there are all of these other factors that we've talked about, throughout the podcast here that are all tailwinds. Essentially, they're all, pushing Bitcoin forward, pushing Bitcoin higher. And, COVID, retail, institution, infrastructure, all these different things. All these different things are all sort of conspiring and working together to help Bitcoin. The one thing I'll add is that there's always black swans, right? Like, COVID itself was a black swan. Like, no one saw that coming. There could be another black swan. We don't know. So, what could that look like? I don't know. It could be something with Grayscale, Bitcoin ETF. It could be something with a world war, quite honestly. It could be aliens. It could be a COVID mutation. It could be, there's so many things. A world leader is assassinated, which could lead to World War III or something like that. there's all of these possibilities for black swan events. I mean, they could happen any minute of any day, obviously, and by their very nature, they're hard to predict. But there's no shortage of black swan events that could be bearish for Bitcoin and prevent it from having a super cycle to $1 million. So it's just something to consider. Obviously, no one knows the future, and I'm excited to see what happens no matter what. Well, guys, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. I'm definitely curious to hear what you guys think. If you think we're going to see a regular cycle or a super cycle, let me know in the comments and give me your reasons. I want to hear your reasons for why you believe what you believe. So thanks, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.